The police captain's hand was on James Brown's shoulder, pulling him away from the microphone. The crowd of 8,000 was on their feet, some screaming, some crying. And then James Brown did something so unexpected that even the officers froze for 180 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was June 12, 1965, at the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium in Alabama. The air was thick with tension, sweat, and the kind of electricity that happens when music meets revolution. James Brown was in the middle of what would become one of the most legendary and dangerous performances of his career. But to understand what happened that night, you need to understand Alabama in 1965. This was the heart of the Jim Crow South, where segregation wasn't just a law, it was a way of life. Just 3 months earlier, state troopers had beaten peaceful protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. The Voting Rights Act hadn't been signed yet. And in Birmingham, the city where 4 little girls had been killed in a church bombing just 2 years before, tensions between black and white communities were explosive. James Brown knew all of this when he booked the show. His manager, a sharp businessman named Ben Waller, had warned him against it. "James, this isn't the time," Waller had said, pacing in the cramped office of their tour bus. "Birmingham is a powder keg. You play to a mixed audience down there, and somebody's gonna get hurt." But James Brown had made up his mind. "Ben, that's exactly why we're going," he'd said, his voice quiet but firm. "If we don't play for everybody, together, then what's the point of any of this? Music doesn't see color, and neither should the people listening to it." So they'd booked the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium and done something radical. They'd sold tickets to everyone. No separate seating sections, no colored balcony and white floor. First come, first served. Black families sitting next to white families. Teenagers of all backgrounds dancing in the same aisles. The local authorities were furious. The police chief, a man named Thomas Crawford, who'd been enforcing segregation for 23 years, had personally visited the venue that afternoon. He'd stood in the lobby, arms crossed, jaw set, and delivered his message to the promoter. "This mixed crowd situation ends tonight, or somebody's going to jail. You tell that boy from Georgia that Birmingham has rules, and he's gonna follow them." The promoter, a nervous man named Eddie Wilson, who'd already sold 8,000 tickets and couldn't afford to cancel, had relayed the message to James backstage. The godfather of soul had simply nodded, adjusted his perfectly pressed suit, and said, "We'll see about that." When the doors opened at 7 p.m., the crowd that poured in was unlike anything Birmingham had seen in a segregated venue. There were black families from the South Side neighborhoods, white college kids from the university, teenagers of all backgrounds who just wanted to hear the hardest working man in show business. They filled every seat, packed the aisles, and created a sea of faces that blurred the color lines the city had spent a century drawing. Backstage, James could hear them. The buzz of excited conversation, the occasional whoop, the sound of 8,000 people ready for something magical. He looked at his band, his horn section, his rhythm guitar player, his drummer Clayton Filio, and he saw the fear in their eyes. "What if they really do arrest us?" Clayton asked, nervously tapping his drumsticks against his leg. James straightened his collar and met each band member's eyes. "Then we get arrested playing the best damn show of our lives. Now let's go make some magic." The show started with an explosion. James hit the stage at 8:15 p.m. with Out of Sight, and the crowd erupted. The energy was immediate, electric, undeniable. People were dancing in the aisles, black kids next to white kids, elderly folks clapping alongside teenagers. The music was doing what music does best, erasing boundaries that didn't make sense in the first place. For the first 45 minutes, it was pure magic. James did his signature moves, winds, the splits, the spins, the famous cape routine. The band was tight, the horns were blazing, and the crowd was completely lost in the moment. Even the police officers stationed around the perimeter couldn't help but tap their feet. But Chief Crawford wasn't tapping anything. He was watching from the back of the venue, arms crossed, face red with anger. This wasn't just a concert to him. It was a direct challenge to the social order he'd spent his career protecting, and he'd decided enough was enough. At 9 p.m., right as James started into Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Crawford made his move. He motioned to 3 of his officers, Captain Robert Hayes, Officer David Mitchell, and Officer John Peterson, and pointed toward the stage. The 3 men began making their way through the crowd, their uniforms and badges creating a wake of nervous energy as they passed. People stopped dancing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone in that auditorium could feel that something was about to go very, very wrong. James saw them coming. He was mid-verse, hitting every note perfectly, but his eyes tracked those 3 officers as they climbed the side steps onto the stage. The band saw them too, and the music started to falter. The horns missed notes. The bass line wavered. Captain Hayes was a big man, 6'3" and 240 pounds, with the kind of face that had probably never smiled at a black person in his life. He walked right up to James, who was still singing, still moving, still giving everything to that performance. That's when Hayes put his hand on James Brown's shoulder. The contact was shocking, not just to James, but to everyone watching. You didn't touch James Brown during a performance. You didn't interrupt the godfather of soul when he was in the middle of his magic. The audacity of it, the disrespect, the raw display of power, it all happened in that single gesture. The music stopped completely. The crowd's roar died to absolute silence. Hayes leaned in close to James's ear, but his voice was loud enough that the microphone caught it. "This show's over, boy. You're going to walk off this stage right now, or you're going to be dragged off in handcuffs. Your choice." 8,000 people held their breath. James looked at the captain's hand on his shoulder, then out at the crowd. He could see faces frozen in disbelief. Teenagers with tears already forming, parents pulling their children closer, young activists who'd probably marched in Selma and knew exactly what was at stake in this moment. The 3 officers stood behind him, hands on their belts, ready to make good on that threat. The band had completely stopped playing. Ben Waller was stage left, looking panicked, probably calculating bail costs and lawsuit damages. And then James Brown did something that would be talked about for the next 50 years. He reached up slowly and removed Captain Hayes's hand from his shoulder. Not aggressively, not violently, just firmly. He took 1 step back, looked the officer directly in the eyes, and spoke into the microphone. "Sir, with all due respect," James said, his voice steady and clear, "I don't work for you. I work for them." He pointed to the audience. "These people, every single one of them, paid their hard-earned money to be here tonight. They came from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different lives, but they came together because music doesn't care about the color of your skin. Music doesn't ask where you're from or who your daddy is. Music just asks if you're ready to feel something real." The crowd was dead silent, but James could see heads nodding, see people gripping the seats in front of them. Captain Hayes's face went from red to purple. "Boy, you got 3 seconds to—" "I'm not a boy," James interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. I'm a man, and these people deserve a show. Hayes reached for his handcuffs. The other two officers moved closer. The entire auditorium tensed, ready for violence. And that's when James Brown turned his back on the police. He turned to his band, counted off with his fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the music exploded back to life. He started singing "Papa's Got a Brand New Bag" again, right from the verse where he'd been interrupted, like nothing had happened. His voice was stronger than before, more powerful, more defiant. The band, inspired by his courage, played harder than they'd ever played in their lives. The three police officers stood on that stage, stunned. They literally didn't know what to do. In all their years of enforcing segregation, of breaking up integrated gatherings, of maintaining control, nobody had ever just turned around and kept performing. Captain Hayes looked back at Chief Crawford, who was now standing at the back of the auditorium, equally frozen. The chief made a motion, "Come back." Not yet, because something incredible was happening in that crowd. The audience, which had been paralyzed with fear just moments before, started moving again. First it was just a few people clapping along. Then more joined in. Then someone started dancing. Then 2 people. Then 10. Within 30 seconds, all 8,000 people in that auditorium were on their feet, dancing, singing, clapping, creating a wall of sound and movement that said more powerfully than any words could, "You can't stop this." The officers still stood on the stage, but they were irrelevant now. They were surrounded by music and joy and unity, and their authority meant nothing against it. One by one, they backed off the stage, defeated by something they couldn't arrest or intimidate. Chief Crawford, watching from the back, made a decision. He turned and walked out of the auditorium, knowing that if he tried to stop this now, he might have a riot on his hands. Sometimes the smartest thing power can do is recognize when it's been outmaneuvered. James Brown played for another 90 minutes that night. He played every song he knew, every hit, every B-side, every experimental jam. He played until his voice was hoarse and his suit was soaked through with sweat. He played until every person in that audience felt like they'd been part of something bigger than a concert. When he finally left the stage at 11:30 p.m., the crowd didn't stop applauding for 15 minutes straight. Backstage, James collapsed onto a chair, his body exhausted, but his spirit electric. Ben Waller sat beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. "You could have gone to jail tonight," Ben said. "Maybe," James replied. "But we didn't. And you know why?" Ben waited. "Because they were afraid of what would happen if they tried." 8,000 people, all different, all together. That's more powerful than any law they got on the books. The story of that night spread like wildfire through the civil rights movement. It became a symbol of peaceful resistance, of using art and culture to challenge unjust systems. Young activists talked about pulling a James Brown, standing your ground with dignity and refusing to be moved. 3 months later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And while James Brown's defiant performance in Birmingham wasn't the reason for that historic legislation, it was part of the cultural shift that made it possible. It was proof that integration wasn't just a political idea. It was something people actually wanted, something they danced together to prove. Years later, in a 1973 interview, James was asked about that night. The interviewer wanted to know if he'd been scared, if he'd thought about just walking off stage when the police showed up. James had smiled that famous James Brown smile and said, "Scared? Of course I was scared. But you know what I was more scared of? Letting those people down." They'd taken a risk just by sitting next to each other in that audience. The least I could do was take a risk for them. He'd paused, then added, "Besides, music is the most powerful force on earth. It's more powerful than hate, more powerful than fear, more powerful than any law designed to keep people apart." That night in Birmingham, we proved it. The Birmingham Municipal Auditorium doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down in the 1970s and replaced with a parking lot, but there's a small historical marker on the site now that reads, "Here stood a venue where on June 12, 1965, James Brown refused to let authority silence the power of music and unity." Every year on the anniversary of that concert, a few dozen people gather at that marker. Some of them were in the audience that night. Some are children and grandchildren of people who were there. They share stories, play James Brown's music from portable speakers, and remember the night when a man in a perfectly pressed suit showed 8,000 people what courage really looks like. The lesson of that night isn't complicated. It's not about politics or laws or systems. It's about something simpler and more profound. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is just keep doing what's right, even when someone with power tells you to stop. James Brown kept singing, and in those 180 seconds when the police stood on his stage and the crowd held its breath, he showed everyone watching that the music and the unity it creates is stronger than the forces trying to tear us apart. If this story of courage and defiance moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs a reminder about the power of standing up for what's right. And let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment when someone refused to back down in the face of injustice? Drop your stories below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another story about the legends who changed the world, one performance at a time.